Hey, everybody. Hi, can you all hear me? I just learned that this mic was hot while we were up here before, and I was like, oh boy. Hi, my name is Katie Wood-Kirchhoff. I am the Alice Cooney Frayling-Heisen Curator of American Decorative Arts here at Shelburne Museum. And it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce you all to tonight's speaker, Dr. Donna Cassidy. She is a professor emerita in the Department of Art and in the Department of American and New England Studies at the University of Southern Maine. Over her career at USM, Cassidy has taught a range of courses on 19th, I'm out of breath, and 20th century European art, gender, and modern art, and the visual culture of the United States. She's also published and curated exhibitions that address themes related to modernism and regionalism in 20th century American art, people like Marsden Hartley, and themes like the Jazz Age in America. She's currently working on an exhibition at the Farnsworth Museum about U.S. artists in Quebec and Atlantic Canada from 1890 to about 1940, which examines an unexplored region of artistic interest for early 20th century American artists. And as someone who works on this material too, I'm really excited about it because this is sort of like our northern frontier, right? There's a lot of visual exchange, and so it will be fun to see how that all works out. Tonight, Dr. Cassidy will place Maine artist Dahlov Ipcar into creative perspective. While critics have often claimed that Ipcar's body of work exists outside prominent 20th century art movements, Cassidy will argue that Ipcar's creative activity emerged from specific contexts, including the art of her parents, Marguerite and William Zorach, historical and contemporary art culture, traditions in Maine art colonies, and women's art. Please help me in warmly welcoming Dr. Donna Cassidy to the podium.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you for the invitation to come here to talk about Dahlov Ipcar. I will make a confession outright. I'm not an expert on Dahlov's work, but I've looked at it and studied it for a lot of the years that I've been in Maine, which is now decades, 30 years or so. And I was intrigued to think about her work and talk about it, particularly in relationship to many of the other artists that I've come to study over the years in Maine. Over her career, Ipcar worked in a variety of styles, from realist regionalism in the 1930s to cubist collages in the later part of her career. And she worked in different media as well: painting, drawing, prints, rugs, quilts, soft sculptures, right? She did nearly a dozen public murals, and she also illustrated over 30 children's books. This range is quite evident in the exhibition here at the Shelburne Museum, Dahlov Ipcar, the possibilities of patterns, and you see a few examples of work from that exhibit on the screen here. The exhibit is significant in its focus on Ipcar's soft sculpture and the use of commercially available fabrics, their relationship to Ipcar's books, and her work's endless possibilities of pattern, a phrase that she herself used. Ipcar's body of work is significant and distinctive in many ways. She herself talked about her art as being very unique, as being individualistic, and over the years, critics have supported that claim, often labeling her as an independent artist outside the art movements of the day. One critic, for example, wrote, "Interesting in her work is the impossibility of locating the defined limits of a school or style." Ipcar, in a sense, made herself into an outsider. She withdrew from the New York art world with the advent of abstract expressionism in the 1950s and lived in Georgetown, Maine, throughout much of her creative life as an artist. The question I want to pose tonight is is her work so disconnected from other art and art movements of the time? In this lecture, I want to suggest how her creative activity emerged from specific contexts, how it was inspired by and ran parallel to key movements in art of her day. Certainly the art of her parents, Marguerite and William Zorach, modern and contemporary art in Maine, and the textile art of female modernists and late 20th century feminist artists. With this view, I think, we can see how Ipcar drew from a rich visual culture around her to fashion an innovative, singular art that spoke to her time and continues to speak to ours. The most profound influence on Ipcar's art was the art of her parents, Marguerite and William Zorach. Part of the first generation American modernists, the Zorachs were schooled in the European avant-garde and challenged the academic traditions that had defined Western art for centuries. And you can see on the screen two portraits of her parents that Ipcar did at different points in her career. She paid tribute to her parents in these two portraits. Both are seated in 19th century chairs in their 1820s Georgetown, Maine house, with Marguerite's murals visible in the background. And you can see those here. Oops, I'm showing you way too much here. Okay. Okay, oops. So you can see these are murals that I'll show some details of some of her murals, but Marguerite actually decorated their Georgetown, Maine home. William is seated in the chair. He's dressed in his work clothes, his work apron. He was a sculptor. And Marguerite sits embroidering. She too is working. She's actually making art, embroidering textiles, which again, I'll come to in just a moment. Ipcar frequently talked about her parents and how she was encouraged by them, worked alongside them over her career, and she especially valued her mother as a model. She said at one point, "My mother and I painted side by side and exchanged criticism and praise freely as equals." Her parents provided an open, progressive environment for her art education, one in line with modern art and one that really celebrated individual expression. The Zorach's art also provided lessons for Ipcar. It surrounded her as a child and shaped her own vision as an artist. Ipcar spent her early childhood in New York City, living with her parents in the Zorach apartment on 123 West 10th Street in Greenwich Village. That apartment was filled with the art of her parents, as Ipcar remembered. Quote, "Our home was full of color, bright, modern, semi-cubist paintings hung on the walls. The floors were painted bright orange." She noted two works in particular, William's Leo Ornstein at the piano and Marguerite's The Garden. And you see both of these on the screen here. She wrote, "My father's painting of Leo Ornstein's piano concert, a cubist work with lots of bright red, hung on the living room wall along with my mother's cubist painting of lilies, complementing the vermilion floor. In my bedroom hung The Garden, a Fauvist work of my mother's, which is now in the collection of the Portland Museum of Art." These paintings are great examples of the Zorach's interpretation of Cubism and Fauvism, styles that they had learned about when they were in Paris between 1907 and 1911, and afterwards in New York City. William's work on the left is a great example of Cubism with the kind of fracturing of space, the multiple dizzying perspectives, and Marguerite's work, by contrast, is a great example of fauvism with its flat, outlined forms, organic patterns, bright colors. These were all characteristics of that style. In many ways, I think Ipcar's later style is really a combination of these two manners of fauvism and cubism, of her parents' work, in a sense that she was seeing all during her childhood, the cubism of her father in particular, and the more fauvist art of her mother. She combined these two styles as she developed her own later manner in works like Blue Savannah that you see on the screen. Here she brings together the fractured space of cubism, the flat forms and brilliant colors of fauvism, the kind of geometry of cubism, and the linear qualities of fauvism. She labeled this style, by the way, non-intellectual cubism. And she really saw it in opposition to intellectual cubism, this is a great example. When she was, writing and talking about this later work, analytical cubism by Picasso, like the work that you're seeing on the screen, was really considered to be all about, mind games and a very conceptual kind of art. And this art, too, as you can see from this particular example, it's very monochromatic. It's lacking all of that brilliant color that Ipcar herself would bring to her work. And this is a detail of the Blue Savannah on the left. And this is how she explained this new style that she was creating, this non-intellectual cubism. She said, "My present art depends on both the liveliness of the line on the surface and on the underlying geometry. A visual mixture I have developed of fluid lines and sharp-edged shapes. This mixture is not a combination, but an overlaying of the delicate line and fluid form on the sharpness below, a variation of cubism that utilizes geometric shapes as underpainting." So this mixture, this blending that she's talking about here, I think we can see as really the blending of some of those stylistic qualities that she was reading and seeing all the time in her parents' art. Her parents' art, by the way, was not just part of her life growing up when she was in New York, but also when she was in Maine. The Zorachs would eventually, in 1923, buy a house, the 1820 John Riggs house in Georgetown, Maine, which you see here on the screen. And in addition, they would buy more property and a farm and really expand the kind of Zorach estate in Maine. This is where, by the way, the Zorachs, including Ipcar, when she was a young woman, would spend their summers, and eventually Ipcar and her husband Adolf would work one of the farms right near the Zorach estate. So this is what this house looked like, 1820s, a very traditional farmhouse. This is William's drawing of the same building. This is the childhood bedroom of Dahlov, which includes some murals up above here. And it was a house that her mother in particular decorated. So again, here she is as a young woman, a young child, even in this house, and she's being surrounded by the work of her parents. And again, particularly the work of her mother. Ipcar talked about her mother decorating the living room of their main house, quote, with a mural of leaves and animals and nude figures, all done in green. And here's a wonderful detail of this. And as you can see here, Marguerite employed, again, a Fauvist-inspired decorative aesthetic. The flat figures and forms, the repeated organic patterns of both leaf forms and animals. And it even suggests a kind of movement or energy on the surface. And I, couldn't resist showing it in relationship to Matisse's very famous work, The Bonheur de Vivre. Great example of fauvism. If I'm talking about fauvism, and this is what it looked like. It's kind of archetypal fauvism. And you can see that, the qualities of, the figures, the flattened figures is something that Marguerite adapts in her own style as well. This kind of decorative patterning, the flattening of the figure against this kind of unspecific background is something that Ipcar herself would adapt in some of her later work as well. And I would say in particular in some of these murals, but I would say even within some of the books that she did, this is a style that I think, again, is very much informed by that experience of looking at and studying and being inspired by the work of her parents. This, by the way, is a wonderful mural at the Patent Free Library in Bath, Maine, one of the many murals that Ipcar did in the state and elsewhere. Ipcar would certainly also be inspired by the textile work of her mother. Marguerite introduced her to textiles as an artistic medium, and something that would become really critical to her art. Marguerite designed her own clothes and her children's and decorated them with embroidery. And these are not children's clothes at all, but these are a couple of examples of her clothing work. These both are in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. William wrote in his autobiography about Marguerite's exceptional skills as a textile worker. He wrote, Marguerite was very clever and made almost everything we wore except shoes and my suits. She made delightful and charming clothes for the children. This is a wonderful photograph from around 1918 with Marguerite and Dahlov in the studio at 123 West 10th Street. And in back of these two figures is a batik wall hanging, kind of a Indonesian-inspired fabric and textile design. And Ipcar would recall later how the floors in that New York apartment were, quote, covered with my mother's hooked rugs of her own design. She did batik hangings and bedspreads, and every piece of furniture was decorated in vivid colors. And again, you can see one of these examples here. And I think, as I was thinking about this and, going back to some of these early experiences, I think, it's really exciting to think about Ipcar kind of growing up in that environment, right? And seeing all of this. And also, importantly, I think seeing her mother doing all of this artistic work. And I would add at some points really being the breadwinner in the family, but that's another point. In this New York apartment, one of the things that Marguerite also did is she did a mural of the Garden of Eden and then went on to make a textile of this, a hooked rug of this subject as well. This vertically oriented textile now in the Farnsworth Art Museum. It has some of those Fauvist qualities. You can see, the figures kind of outlined here, much like you saw in the work of Matisse, but some of Marguerite's own early paintings, like the garden. And I would say Ipcar not only adopts textiles as a medium, but even takes some of these subjects from her mother as well. And of course, one of the standout works in the Shelburne exhibition, right, is the Garden of Eden. Here, Ipcar cuts and collages printed cotton fabric to represent the animals in paradise, the ox and the antelope, leopard and peacock, as well as the serpent with a long forked tongue tempting Adam and Eve in the center part of the composition. This is a little bit more complicated than Marguerite's version, but you can see Adam and Eve at the bottom here and the serpent. And again, this is a collage version, not a hooked rug like her mother's, but certainly, I think that work by her mother's would have been very much in her mind, right? When she was going back to this particular theme in her work later in her career. This was 1961. Well, the memory of her mother's work perhaps shaped this work, The Garden of Eden. She made direct references to her mother's textile work on other occasions. Ipcar was inspired by this particular bedspread by Marguerite, which was commissioned in the 1920s and is now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It describes a whole array of domestic scenes, a couple at times with children, enjoying the warmth and comfort of home, playing music, frolicking in the garden, enjoying nature. It is a kind of vision of an Eden, right? And I would say this is probably an imagining of the Zorach family in Maine, enjoying this kind of Edenic life. Ipcar certainly kept this work in mind. Later in her career, she made this oil painting that you see on the right, which was inspired by one of the scenes in that bedspread. These figures that you see there on the left, riding nude on a horseback, kind of have a mythological feel to them. But they're also what is also noteworthy to me as I was looking at this detail are these patterned horses, right? That shows kind of the ancestors of, here we go, the ancestors of some of these soft sculptures. So that, again, the kind of parallelism between Ipcar's and her mother's work, I think is really, really striking. And this particular bedspread and so many other works by Marguerite, as well as untold books by her father, show yet another way in which her parents' art, I think, influenced her, helped to shape her work. And that is they were all very interested in representing animals in art, right? So this was common, and I could give you a whole lecture on that, which I won't do. This is just one comparison to show that connection. The work on the left, which is in the exhibition here in the Shelburne, Leopard and Tiger, and Marguerite's cat rug over there on the right. And I think both of these, of course, are hooked rugs, and in terms of the media, they are very much connected. But the patterning, the visual patterning on the surface, the echoing of the kind of lines of the leopard and the tiger here, and if you look at this cat, this curvilinear cat, and the edge of the frame that surrounds the cat, that all kind of keeps on echoing that same visual pattern, right? So this idea of patterning, which is really essential to Ipcar's work, is something that she's learning here from her parents as well. This hook rug technique that we're seeing here too, I think really connects to another important group of influences on Ipcar, and that is the work of modernists in Maine, as well as the folk art that they were inspired by. So I want to turn my attention right now to talk a little bit about Maine as a context for Ipcar's work. She decided, as I said, to move to Maine and really be working away from the New York art scene. And while Maine certainly did not, in the earlier part of the 20th century, have the extensive infrastructure of art that it has now, it still had, quite a rich artistic culture, right? So there were lots of artists who were already living there year-round. Certainly many in the summertime, and even many more who would be coming to the art colonies in the summer as well. And so it's this kind of context that really, I think, shaped some of her vision. This is not Maine, by the way, but one of the first ways that we can see Maine shaping Ipcar's art is in her embrace of what I might call regionalism, right? The embrace of subject matter about contemporary life in Maine. And she talked about later about being influenced in her early work by social realism, but really what she was talking about was the art of the 1930s that represented contemporary life or American scene painting, as well as the representation of place, of locale, of region. So that became, I think, very important to her in the early part of her career. The work that you're looking at here on the screen is one of the murals that she was very influenced by and admired in New York City. This is a work by Thomas Hart Benton. America Today is the title of this mural series. I forget how many panels there are. It was done for the New School for Social Research in New York. Now you can see it at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And one of the things that Benton did in this mural is that he focused on contemporary American life, and he also focused on place, different places. So, you have the contemporary exciting life and world of city activities in New York on the left. And then you had all these other scenes in the series that focused on particular American regions. So you have this representation of the Deep South and the tenant workers and the cotton farmers and laborers in the South. And so, so she was very interested in this art that she was seeing in New York. But I would also say that, when she came to Maine and when she was in Maine, she would have continued to see this kind of art that focused on place and particularly focused on everyday life and in place, in the region, in Maine. And one of the places that this was happening in Maine in the 1930s and 40s when she's first in the state is in the many post office murals that were being painted at that time. There was a whole project that was funded by the New Deal and funded by the Treasury section of Fine Arts, and post offices across the country, new post offices that were being built at the time, would include these murals. And the murals typically would focus on local history and culture. So it was a way to really cultivate that idea of, what is community, what is place. And in Maine, Ipcar would have seen at least 12 different examples that were being painted at that time. This particular example by Waldo Pierce. Pierce was a friend of the Zorach family. And this particular mural was at the Westbrook Public Library. And it focuses here on woodsmen in the woods of Maine, the subject of lumbering and woods work that was one of the most popular themes of these murals in the state of Maine that really dealt with, the productive labor during the Depression and really was intended to be uplifting. And it also was intended to create that sense of pride about history and pride of place. Not only would Ipcar have seen these kinds of subjects in these post office murals, but around her as well. Her mother's work transitioned to this much more, regionalist style in the late 20s and into the 1930s. This work on the left, Land and Development of New England, it really could be called Land and Development of Maine. She did in 1935. It's now at the Farnsworth Art Museum. And, you have this strong family group in the center, this father, probably, William Zorach here, this kind of family group, again, that self-referential, the family group here in his flannel shirt, his LL Bean boots. He's the hunter. He's, the guy of Maine. And, in the background, you see the fields being plowed and the forests being cleared. So you see this, this economy of Maine being represented. So it's very much about place. And this work by Pierce on the right, I think, is a really great kind of parallel to what we'll see in Ipcar's own work. Pierce focused, he was a Bangor-born artist and worked in Maine in the 30s and 40s and beyond. And he really focused on rural life. And this is what, became her subject matter in those very first works. Her painting Ice Harvest from 1938 on the left, and Gentling the Colt, perfect farm scenes of Maine, right? The ice cutting that still was happening at this time. And the foreground figure, by the way, is her husband. Her husband, Adolf, served as the model for this figure. And Gentling the Colt, perfect, the beloved animals, farm animals of Ipcar's during this time, the activity, the work of taming, training these animals. These are her subjects at this time. And by the way, I love that L.L. Bean bought the ice cutting over there on the left, proves how, successful she was at speaking to a kind of Maine and regional identity. And, I almost, cut this section out about these more realistic representations of Maine, but I do think it's important for her work. And again, I think that especially in some of those earliest book illustrations, you really see that same kind of flavor of a kind of realist regionalism, and even in some cases a real Maine quality. So the books are filled with lots of decorative qualities and decorative aesthetics, but there's some of this realistic representation in these early works as well. And this is her very first book of illustrations that she did for Margaret Wise Brown's The Little Fisherman in 1945. But I think the other and somewhat more important work that we see her drawing from in Maine is the whole tradition of modernism in Maine, and particularly the work of modernists who were interested in folk art, right? Interested in the art of itinerant portrait painters, rural communities. And this is a kind of art that surrounded Ipcar, not only the work of these modernists, but the folk art itself, right? I want to talk a little bit about this. I mean, Ipcar certainly knew her parents' friends, her parents' artist friends, and fellow modernists working in Maine, and the folk art that they collected. Her father, William, spent summers hunting antiques and collecting objects from America's historical material culture. He wrote about the 1920s in his autobiography, quote, "All of us were picking up early modern furniture and early American paintings because they were not only more beautiful than the manufactured products that were being sold, but they were also very cheap." Right? The Zorachs would decorate their house in Maine, and see that detail of it, with these objects, and you can see some of that furniture in there. And their neighbors in Georgetown, Isabel and Gaston Lachaise. Gaston Lachaise, who was a major sculptor, good friends with the Zorachs, also decorated their house with the antiques that they were collecting. And so on the right here, you can see the library, the view of the second floor library in the Lachaise house in Georgetown. And you see, I expect that's a hooked rug in the foreground here. You've got a ladder back chair, some works on the wall that look like there's, part of this tradition, a table that looks very much like a shaker table. So this is what she's seeing. Again, this kind of environment of folk art that's being built up around her. Yeah, so this is really important. And one of the other things she had talked about in one of her interviews, 1979 interview, she talked about visiting the house of the sculptor, Robert Laurent. And Laurent, along with the painter, critic, and art collector Hamilton Easterfield, founded the Summer School of Graphic Arts in Ogunquit, Maine, in 1911. And this was one of the schools in that art colony in the early part of the century. And Field and Laurent collected art from the surrounding rural communities, just as Zorach had as well. And they decorated and furnished the studios that were actually fishing shacks, right? These fishing shacks that were studios that they went out to artists over the summer. And they decorated them with these objects. So these objects that included portraits by itinerant portrait painters, ladderback chairs, decoys, weather vanes, samplers, quilts, hooked rugs, reverse glass paintings. It sounds like the Shelburne collection, right? And so so Laurent, was collecting this material, bringing back to the colonies. The artists that came to the colonies were looking at this art. This is a painting by Bernard Carfield. Carfield was one of the many Ogunquit artists, Ogunquit colony artists associated with Laurent and Hamilton Easterfield. This painting, Making Music, Ogunquit, of 1938, shows the interior of Laurent's home. And I think what's noteworthy here are, these portraits on the back, right? These are, these itinerant portraits by itinerant folk painters. This one, by the way, is by has been attributed to Zedediah Belknap, and I think that I saw one of his paintings when I was going around the galleries today. So this was the kind of, and this is certainly what Webb was collecting as well. I mean, this was this was something that was happening across the art world in the 1920s and 30s and beyond. But the important point that I want to make too is that they weren't just collecting this art and these objects. They were learning from these objects. They felt that these earlier American objects and art had something to teach the modern artist. So you have someone like Robert Laurent using and developing what he called the direct carving technique that he adapted from his study of decoys, right? Duck decoys, right? So the idea, by the way, direct carving was a process of making where, the sculptor just directly carved into an object into the wood, into stone, without doing studies or sketches. And it was in opposition to this long-standing tradition in Western art where the sculptor would make, ceramic models, wax models, before, they would touch the marble. Everything would have to be planned out. This idea of direct carving was something that sculptors like Laurent saw in evidence, right, in works like these duck decoys that they saw also as a more honest way of working, more authentic, a kind of a community or communing and communicating with the material and the artist. So there was a sense of much more authentic kind of expression by this method as opposed to that very studied method of making sculpture. So that was one of the lessons. And I think the other lesson is very obvious in this comparison is that Laurent is very much simplifying the form of the duck, right? There's not a lot of details. There's largely this, broad form, the oval form of the body, and the head is kind of tucked in. Again, very much learning from that model of the decoys in particular, I think. One of the other artists who was in the Ogunquit art colony was Marsden Hartley. And on the left, you see one of Hartley's reverse paintings on glass that he did get inspired by the collection of early American paintings on glass that were in the collection of Robert Laurent. So this painting on the left here is painted on glass, right? And he's also using a method of flattening the figures, flattening the forms, outlining them against a very flat background of these series of color squares, right? And he's really modeling himself or modeling this painting after early American works like this flower and fruit bowl in the Metropolitan Museum, which also was done with this particular methodology, this reverse painting on glass. So these were this whole group of artists that were looking at these earlier examples, inspired by them. And I think we can see Ipcar doing a similar kind of thing, right? I mean, I can't say that I found this exact work that she was looking at, but I think she was looking at a lot of this folk art. This painting by gold and silver by her in 1972, I found particularly striking in relationship to some of these weather vanes, like the one that you're seeing on the screen, this one from the late 19th century in the Museum of Fine Arts. And you can see that, again, the simplifying, the flattening of the form, creating a much more decorative quality. And if she didn't see this, she might have seen this one, which was actually in Portland, Maine. It was, I think, when she was there on the Cumberland County courthouse, and then later it was moved to the First National Bank. So she had lots of models to look at. The one last main connection that I want to point out, which I would actually love to do more work on before I turn to my very last point, is the connection between her work and the work of her friend Bernard Langley, right? So this work by Ipcar, which is of course a wonderful menagerie of exotic animals, fantastical leopards and hyenas and wildebeests, right? Done in this very kind of dense overlay of forms that kind of interlock together. I think, it really recalls to me the work of Bernard Langley. Langley was an artist. They were friends. I mean, the connection is very evident, right? This is not something I'm saying, don't they look alike? Well, yeah, they do look alike, but they were also friends. They were connected. They worked closely together. Langley lived in Cushing, Maine, not far from Ipcar. His sculptural work was really focused in wood. He worked in intarsia and relief sculpture, freestanding sculpture. He preferred animals as a subject matter. So, I mean, these are all kind of bonds between these two artists. And I think they both have kind of animal forms that hover between, the imaginative and the real. I mean, there's this abstract real dialogue. And I think you can see that in this work by him, Indian Jungle Scene. And there's a detail so you can see a little bit more of that really complicated layering. And the other thing, there's also somewhat sense of humor in some of his sculpture that I think is not unlike what we see sometimes in Ipcar's work as well. I love these lions by him. You've got the lion body in profile and then this head that looks out at you. And I was also struck in the textile gallery here that there's a hooked rug that has a very similar kind of animal. So the way in which all of these, the folk art and modernism, all kind of come together in Langley's work and Ipcar's work. And I think their relationship is something that really does need to be explored, or should be explored a little bit more. Final point and final group of works that I want to talk about are in some ways an important point to be made about the context of Ipcar's art. Her work also parallels the art of female modernists working in textiles in the early 20th century and those in the feminist art movement in the 1970s and 80s. Now, Ipcar was not formally part of these movements, but her art I think, should be seen as advancing their efforts to have women's art accepted as fine art. Women's art, right? Women's art as a category was often used to describe domestic arts, right? Art that was like needlepoint, needlework samplers and pictures and rugs, quilts, like the examples that you see on the screen here. It was associated with women's traditional role as caretakers of the home, the family, and children in the pre-modern period. In art historical narratives, women's art was relegated as craft, right? So it was considered of lower value and less important than the fine arts of painting and sculpture. Female artists of the 20th century worked to raise the value of women's art, of this material culture. And foremost among those, of course, was Ipcar's mother, Marguerite, right? So I've already talked a little bit about her textile work. And one of the points that I would make right now is that her textile art really grew out of her role as a mother, right? That she began to work in textiles because she found it easier to work with textiles, kind of pick it up, drop it, taking care of two kids, right? Tessin and Dahlov, which were, very, here she is taking care of them in the context of the studio. So she discovered the value of this into her work. And I would say too, her textiles eventually sold very well and became a major source for the family income over the years. She worked also to advance, textile as a fine arts. And this was in many of her statements and many of her interviews, she made it a point to talk about textiles, not as textiles, but as art, right? So this is a quote from one of her interviews in 1956. She says, "I want to write about embroideries as art, as painting and sculpture and tapestries are art. And even then, I do not wish to go back into the past, rather to write of my own embroidered tapestries, which are an art expression unique with me and not like anything done before. But they are related in spirit. They are related in spirit to early art embroideries of America, but these were the expression of un-art conscious people. Mine is the art expression of a developed artist, aware of using abstract qualities and new freedoms of this modern age in art." So, here she's, really advocating for this. Her work itself really shows the way that she used, again, the Fauvist language, abstraction in her textile work as a way to elevate it into the realm of fine arts. And you can see Ipcar really emulating that process in her own work. I would say, like her mother, some of her earliest textile work comes out of her role as a mother, right? So she makes this pieced quilt with embroidered applique animals in 1940 as a quilt for one of her sons, right? And then she, here's the wonderful detail of that. Oops. And then her soft sculptures, in a similar way, come out of that tradition, right? She initially makes them as, kind of toys for her boys. And then she starts giving them as gifts. And then they become accepted as fine art in this very complicated use of patterning in textiles. So that sense of, her really being aware of what her mother did. She did write and taught, or I should say, said at one point, "My mother raised the crafts she did to the level of fine art, embroidering large tapestries which now hang in museums. She was a marvelous role model for me." And so that sense of taking the domestic, transforming it into fine arts is an important part of both Marguerite Zorach's work and Ipcar's work. And then we step back for a minute, we can see that they were also participating in a much larger project to raise textiles to fine arts by female artists in the modernist movement. Sonia Delaunay, who is a French artist who worked within the rubric of Orphism, she, like Zorach, was really interested in translating the style of Orphisms, bright colors, contrasting abstract color forms, into new patterns of clothing and fabric. So you have this fabric design and this wonderful dress design over here on the left as well. And I will also add that Sonia Delaunay did do a lot of art, a lot of textile art for her kids when they were little book covers and bedclothes and things like that. And then not only in France, but in Germany, in the Bauhaus movement, you had the all-female weaving class at the Bauhaus in Germany applying these kind of crisp, abstract forms to an array of textile arts, from wall hanging to upholstery fabrics. And you see a couple of examples on the screen here. Now, these female modernists, I would argue, they both prospered, but were limited by working in this media, as textiles were still considered to be secondary to the fine art of painting, sculpture, and architecture. The Bauhaus, claimed that male and female artists were equal, but the reality was that for female artists, they were often placed in the weaving workshop and faced a lot of obstacles getting into other schools within the Bauhaus. The project of making textiles accepted as a fine art continued with the feminist art movement of the 1970s and 1980s. Miriam Schapiro led this effort to recognize women artists of the past and critique male-dominant narratives of art history that excluded women artists and women's textile art. Schapiro created what she called femages, which were feminist collages, and this is a great example of one of these. It has cut lace, cotton, mesh squares that are set into acrylic paint that kind of evokes a patchwork quilt, right? And she was really celebrating, especially in the title here, Anonymous was a woman, right? All of these women of the past, right, who had made things, but we never knew who they were. And she was really referencing some of these early histories that were being written around this same time, this really groundbreaking work by Mira Banks called Anonymous was a Woman that really documented a lot of this early American textile art. And Schapiro was not alone in this project. Joyce Kozlov, whose work you see here on the screen, joined with Schapiro in really emphasizing the importance of textiles as a fine art. Both of their works, by the way, and the work that they were doing were sometimes called the pattern and decoration movement, And again, they sought to bring the history of women's art, textiles in particular, into the world of highly valued abstraction. During this time, a lot of male artists like Frank Steller, oh, isn't this great stuff? And it was pretty much what you saw in early quilts and early American textiles. I would argue that Ipcar really shared this pattern and decoration aesthetic and desire to have her textile art accepted as a fine art. Her work has much in common with Schapiro and Kozlov, even though she didn't belong to this movement or directly participate in it. The golden jungle that you see on the screen here is defined by surface rhythms, visual rhythms and patterns, these decorative surfaces. She is really creating textile art as fine art. And so many works by Ipcar use this patterning, right? These possibilities of patterns as a foundation for fine art, just as many of her colleagues were in the later part of the 20th century. The art critic Carl Little has said Ipcar's work has always defied categories, and it certainly does in many ways, but it also intersects with many other categories of art. The work of her parents' colleagues in Maine, and the larger circle of modernists working in the state and studying folk art, of women's textile art of the past, and of Ipcar's own time. She was isolated from New York, the New York art scene in Maine, but her work wasn't created in isolation. As I hope I've suggested in the lecture, Ipcar was surrounded by a rich visual culture. It was her genius to bring together in her own way elements from that visual world and the particular current concerns of what it meant to be a woman creating art in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that. I feel just, there's such rich knowledge in it. I feel so much even more curious about this, and that's what good learning should do, is make us more curious.
Well, I feel more curious about Dahlov Ipcar's work, having just done this, and as I said, really concentrating on her work in a way that I haven't done a lot in the past. And so and as I've suggested, there are in some ways more questions I have, about her work as well.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of questions, we do have a little bit of time if there's anybody who would like to ask a question or share something or reflection based on what we've heard how to share. Anyone? Yeah, I'll come right over to you.
Are her books still available for me to give to my grandchildren?
Do you want to answer that?
Can you?
So are her books still
Yes.
available if I want to give them to my grandchildren?
Yes, I mean, I don't know what's available in Vermont. I assume you can get them online. I know most of the museums in Maine have them. I bought some for my niece and grandniece and nephew a couple of years ago. So they're still out there, definitely. And I think a number of them have been reissued. And there's a great Dahlov Ipcar website. I think Rachel Walls runs that. So if you go online and you put in Dahlov Ipcar, that's one of the first things that will come up. And that will kind of give you a list of things that are still available. But they are, and kids love them. I mean, I love them.
Local TV had a bunch of order client days, so people they were able to guess. Sometimes that are out, and so you would have to get a second half. One of those, several of them still are available to purchase. Yeah. Other questions, other thoughts? I'll come up front and then I'll circle back to you.
Do you know if the Zorach home or Ipcar's home is public or was it privately owned at this point?
Yeah, the Zorach home is still privately owned, so it's not. When I've seen it, it's been like in private tours or for research. I don't know if there's any plans to open those up in the future. One of the kind of future things about that some of you might be interested in. I know that the Portland Museum of Art is planning a Marguerite Zorach exhibition. I think it's 2 years from now. So maybe there'll be some activity around that, including some tours to the house as well. Yeah.
We have a question right here.
I'm interested in the heritage of her parents. Did they come, well, they were before, but they come from abroad and have been influenced by that experience. And it appears as though there's some African, at least, animals in Brooklyn. Did she travel? Did they travel, or were they?
Well, they certainly didn't travel to Africa, I will say. William Zorach was an immigrant. I can't remember where he came from. Was it Lithuania? I thought, okay, he was from Lithuania, somewhere in Eastern Europe. He was from Lithuania, and she lived in California. I mean, her family was a little bit more, I guess, established in this country. I certainly think, I remember reading a lot about how, William certainly initially struggling with the language, but they met when they were in Paris. They were both students in Paris. So that's how, and then they came back and that's all. And I think, if I remember correctly, her aunt was trying to kind of separate, took her on a tour of, all over Europe and North Africa, and so there was that kind of separation. You had asked a second question on.
Which I think that was.
About the animals, I think that Dahlov, when she was young, I mean, she went to the zoos in New York. There were actually exotic wild animal farms in Maine, if you can believe that. And she was a great, consumer of things like National Geographic, Natural History Museum. So she learned about animals that way. So, she probably saw some of these animals, but not in the wild, right? So she often talked about creating them from her imagination. So she wasn't an artist who, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to describe this. This was not her process at all. She really talked about the imagination, the inventiveness is really essential to the way that she made things. So she looked at stuff like National Geographic and zoos and so forth, but she transformed that in this imaginative way. I mean, different, I don't know, blue wildebeests, I don't think they exist. So I mean, there are definitely ways she's inventive, which is perfect for the children's books also that she creates, I think, right?
Did you want to say something? Sure. I'm wearing. We have two of the same shirts. Oh, wait, maybe take a picture of you two together. You all stand together. Jason's gonna take the picture. We're also friends. Will you pose quickly for a picture? You're on a picture. Thank you for your patience on that.
I saw that. I was like, what's in my eyes? Yeah, I'm talking about the Liberty Graphics for Liberty Graphics at one point did the print, Liberty out of Liberty, Maine.
Yep.
And they did the Little Fisherman.
Yep.
I don't know if they still are.
I don't know.
But
I have a more male oriented one. But Doug gave me this one, and I've always liked the colors. And I fished it out this one. And like, hey, they may still be available. It's possible that Rachel does.
yeah, no, it's done by Liberty Graphics.
Yeah, but somebody did.
Right, yes, they make this go, yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing that, both of you. Got one more question over here, and then we can wrap up, but I'd love to come right over here.
I would ask about their art training, their training of the Zorachs and the Ipcar. Did they go to art school, or what kind of training did they go?
Well, they went to, when they were in Paris, they went to some of these, little academies that were really outside of the Beaux-Arts Academy. So that I think the Academy called Rossi, I think, so there was some training there. Ipcar's was a lot, they had the attitude that we don't want to constrict her by training her. I mean, by having her learn in certain ways. So I think her training was much more intuitive and much more of this, like, this is the art that surrounds me. This is what I'm learning from, and working from that. So she didn't go to like a formal art school. And I think the other thing, the number of art schools, like now that we think about art schools, I mean, it's a post-World War II phenomenon. I mean, there was the Academy, there was National Academy of Design and places like that. There was the Robert Henry School, but these were much smaller kinds of training grounds than what we're used to these days.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for coming out on this Friday night. And let's give one more giant round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Just in case you don't know, the main